From the onset, the 2013 general election was decisive, not just for Kenya, but the two individuals on the ballot. President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto were on a joint ticket, and they shaped their campaign in such a way that their cases at the International Criminal Court became a major issue and formed part of the campaign. Their 2013 struggle was emotive, to say the least, coined in a way that voting for the duo was voting against the International Criminal Court and the crimes they were facing. Kenyan self-respect seemed on the line, and Kenyatta and Ruto successfully exploited that.
Sisi tumekubali ya kwamba tutafanya kazi pamoja na hiyo koti. Unaelewana? Lakini lazima pia wajue na waheshimu ya kwamba sisi pia tuko na katiba. Tunaelewana? Haiwezekani iwe Ruto yuko nje na mimi niko nje.
These two were indicted in after the violence that happened, and after that, of course, they used the narrative that the International Criminal Court was an imperialist court, and by so doing, Uhuru and Ruto coined or made the narrative of the election around the anti-ICC sentiment, which almost broke down the relationship between Kenya and the West. But of course, you can see just prior to the elections, the former US ambassador who was overseeing the African policy, I think that was Carson, who even talked about choices of consequences. That was to the extent that showed the extent to which the relations between, what we call geographical West and the supposed, had Uhuru and Ruto won the election, this would have really ruined the relations.
With regard to who is facing the international court, and mostly it is Africans and other third world countries. But Americans have not been tried. Western Europeans have not been tried. South Africans are saying, well, apart from Nuremberg trial, there's not been much of European tried. So they said this thing is set for Africa as opposed to a global court that is assessing the world. That was the argument, and that argument appealed to most African countries. South America were really supported of Uhuru, Ruto not going through there.
As the polls drew closer, the Obama administration's top official for Africa, Johnny Carson, issued a thinly veiled warning which appeared to contradict the stand taken by the then US President Barack Obama on the elections.
The choice of who will lead Kenya is up to the Kenyan people. The United States does not endorse any candidate for office, but we do support an election that is peaceful and reflects the will of the people.
Carson, during a conference call about the vote, said that Kenyans were free to pick their own leaders, but that choices had consequences.
Choices have consequences. We live in an interconnected world, and people should be thoughtful about the impact that their choices have on their nation, on their region, on the economy, on the society, and the world in which they live. Choices have consequences.
Kenya need to understand and be very clear on really the thinking of America. America principle, America development, America policy is based on human right and liberty for all and the rule of law. And that is the policy that govern America. And so when the expression came down and people say choice have consequences, you become president with a tarnished reputation, with so many people who died and suffer, then the country as a whole will have to pay. That was the message from Johnny Carson at that particular time.
The Western concerns about Kenyatta's candidacy seemed to provoke a backlash.
This international crimes is not a small feat. And by so doing, and of course we know this court is based in the West. So in general, the West had reservations about the candidature of Uhuru and Ruto at that particular time, which in effect endeared Uhuru and Ruto in the country. So they were able to make this as a narrative, anti-Western narratives, to woo a lot of support within the country.
Once in office, the cases commenced, but not for long. With their ICC cases stalling due to lack of compelling evidence, one would wonder whether this formed the basis of Uhuru's initial abrasive nature with the West.
There was no collective focus on these are the people we don't want to become president. There was nothing like that they didn't want Uhuru to become president or Ruto to become president. What was happening is the imagery. What a criminal person. We've been talking here a lot about Sonko. America talk about Trump. How can this kind of person become president?
The nature of foreign policy is very dynamic. So after he had won the elections in 2013, with again going back to the anti-ICC narrative, you could see him trying to win new allies. And these new allies included looking east.
The indicted Kenyan leader looked to the east. Beijing congratulated President Kenyatta for winning the elections and Kenyans for voting peacefully, indicating that it looked forward to close cooperation with Nairobi and the president-elect when he takes office. This was a very different approach. 4 months after being sworn in as the commander-in-chief, President Kenyatta began a visit to the country that was fast becoming Kenya's biggest economic engine. It was not the United States, one of Kenya's biggest aid donors, nor was it former colonial power, the Great Britain. It was China.
So Kibaki was the first president to really look at East and say, what can we get from China? How can we benefit? So Uhuru went East full throttle, knowing that the West are going to sand them, they're going to have a hard time.
Kenyatta's choice of Beijing as one of the first places outside Africa to pay an official state visit to since his inauguration in April 2013 spoke volumes about China's growing presence in Kenya. According to diplomatic analysts, this highlighted Nairobi's strengthening focus on its Look East policy.
China and Kenya are comprehensive, strategic, and cooperative partners. In recent years, under the strategic guidance and personal attention of President Xi Jinping and President Uhuru Kenyatta, the broader China-Kenya relations have reached new heights unmatched in history.
The Look East policy is not necessarily a creation of Uhuru Kenyatta. If you look at President Mwai Kibaki's foreign policy after his win in 2002-2003, he began embracing the East by looking East. And we saw a lot of contracts going to the East and so on and so forth. So it was not a new phenomenon under the Uhuru Kenyatta presidency per se. But as you put it, it's true that it became more aggressive. And again, using the anti-ICC tag, you can see them embracing the Chinese, the Russians with those state visits, as you have said. And this, to a great extent, did not go very well with the traditional West. But of course, it was an act of balancing the relations between the East and the West.
Given what had unfolded over the past few months in Kenya just before the elections, it was not surprising that Kenyatta chose China as well as Moscow, Russia, before Washington. Both China and Russia remained silent over allegations that President Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto committed crimes against humanity at the time of Kenya's disputed 2007 elections. During Kenyatta's visit, Kenya and China exchanged vows of friendship and spoke of widening economic and political cooperation at talks between President Kenyatta and Xi Jinping. This signaled Beijing's growing interest and presence in the continent.
China always appreciates Kenya's invaluable support wherever China's interest is concerned, including Kenya's firm commitment to the One China principle.
The diplomatic toasting at the Great Hall of the People culminated to the signing of deals worth $5 billion, with China committing to build a railway line and an energy project. This was just the beginning of long trade ties between the two countries that birthed huge infrastructural projects like the newly launched Nairobi Expressway, SGR, China's flagship investment project in Kenya, which connects the port city of Mombasa with Nairobi, among others. But the deals didn't come without challenges. President Kenyatta's administration largely took loans from China since 2014 to build roads, bridges, dams, and power plants. This started after Kenya became a lower middle income economy, locking her out of highly concessional loans from development lenders such as the World Bank and IMF. The Bank of China loans to Kenya have been a key issue during this electioneering period, with Beijing being accused of being a predatory lender which is engaging in debt trap diplomacy.
China is not. A brief response. You see, Kenya owns less than 20% of its external debt to China. China is not, to the Chinese creditors, China is not Kenya's biggest lender. Labeling China as the main creditor or singling China out in the debt debate, debt narrative is clearly an overstatement.
A basic economic exchange is willing buyer and willing seller, okay? And so if you're weak, you're easily going to be exploited. When you talk about econometric without anything else. We're benefiting in relationship and infrastructure with China. Why I'm saying benefiting, it looks like a huge debt that we have accumulated, where we need to be very careful. But it is very visible what they're leaving behind. This is ours. The highway system, the houses, the way they're built, they're ours forever and ever, and we have to pay for them.
You know, concessional loans and sometimes grants. If you look at other examples like Zambia or Sri Lanka, we have seen this argument of the debt trap diplomacy, because what the Chinese are doing is actually giving very good loans and not looking at other issues such as human rights, democracy, and the like. But as a scholar, I tend to also see this is also double standards in the sense that the IMF and the World Bank also did similar, gave similar loans with very damaging, conditionalities.
2 years later, in January 2015, determined to advance Kenya's agenda on the global stage, President Kenyatta launched for the first time since the country's independence a detailed foreign and diaspora policy which sought to enhance the country's engagements with other nations.
We have redefined our foreign policy to ensure that it properly supports robust, reciprocal, bilateral and multilateral relations in trade, taxation and investment. We will be on the constant lookout for opportunities all over the world that it can increase the prosperity of our people and their businesses. Particularly, we will target new economic powers and more traditional economic partners who are seeking to increase our trade and investment relations.
When all the dust will settle, when all the politics are out, President Uhuru Kenyatta is going to be known in Kenya as the man who put Kenya on the world map, regional map and global map. Let me say this. Our gross national product, when you compare to the region of East Africa, we are $110 billion. The entire region of East Africa, including DRG Congo, is $240 billion. So Kenya is almost half in terms of our ability economically for the East Africa. We're almost half of that. We are also, when we talk about global firepower, that is the military term for your military capability and everything. We are much more superior than any other country in East and Central Africa.
This could be one of the biggest legacies under the Uhuru Kenyatta's presidency, to cement and have a written document. That doesn't mean that Kenya did not have a coherent foreign policy. On the contrary, it's now that they were able to have a well-written and documented framework that guided Kenya's foreign policy, which is, of course, a big legacy of the Uhuru Kenyatta presidency.
Kenyatta's foreign policy was pegged on 5 pillars: economic diplomacy, peace diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and diaspora diplomacy. In the past 10 years, the Kenyan president has perpetuated an unblinking business-led foreign policy in the region and abroad, starring in the play.
I think when all is said and done, and we can say it, when all the sun falls, even now in the current politics, President Kenyatta will be known as the most outstanding foreign policy leader for this country, way surpassing his father, way surpassing Moi, surpassing Kibaki, because of his careful crafting, his move in terms of foreign policy.
He has been lauded for his aggressiveness towards championing Kenya's foreign policy, unlike in 2013 when he displayed a harsh tone towards the West. After the launch of his foreign policy in January 2015, President Kenyatta seemed to have softened his stance on the Western countries.
So Uhuru moved back now and become much more comfortable with America. And because America have significant interest in Kenya and the British have significant interest in Kenya, that become very easy. Now, then what I was saying earlier, under Bush administration, when they went to The Hague, it was not American picking and punishing 2 people. It was the principle that ran American foreign policy, which is for civil right and a country of law and order.
Almost a year after his first visit to the US as president in August 2014, President Kenyatta welcomed the then US President Barack Obama in Nairobi for a 2-day official visit. Obama was the first US president in office to visit the country, his ancestral home. This visit offered the clearest indication of the continued warming of Kenya-US relations, which had sunk to their lowest depths in early 2013 with the election of Uhuru Kenyatta as Kenya's head of state, despite warnings from US officials that voters should not elect someone facing crimes against humanity charges at the ICC.
America had no interest in punishing Kenya or punishing Uhuru or Ruto. Later on, Uhuru find that. And so what Obama was saying, Obama was interested in Kenya prospering, moving to middle class, and everybody benefit. And Kenya then become a strategic partner of the United States.
The United States and Kenya elevated their relationship to a strategic partnership in 2018. Kenya is a critical U.S. security partner in the region, especially in the fight against terrorism. Kenyatta has met both President Donald Trump and Joe Biden at the White House. The head of state also met Theresa May, the then Kenya's former colonial master prime minister, in 2018 at State House, Nairobi. The Kenyan leader complained that no British prime minister had visited Kenya for 30 years, delivering a diplomatic rebuke to Theresa May. Before May's tour, the last British prime minister to visit Kenya was Margaret Thatcher in 1988. Since then, despite historic links between the two nations, Kenya has increasingly turned to China and the US for support and investment. This balance between the East and the West has seen Kenya remain on the global stage, influencing key issues, especially on climate change and peace and security. In February 2022, Kenyatta was named the chairperson for the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. Kenyatta's foreign policy also gave attention to the South-South cooperation, with Kenya partnering with her African counterparts and other global South countries in the economic, political and social spheres.
Well, this is actually through the framework of the ACP countries, that's the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, and they have been able to do this through improved trade relations. For example, they have worked through the EPAs, the External Partnership Agreements, which enable South countries in the global South to have some sort of bargaining advantage as they trade with their counterparts in the West. So to a great extent, this is also a legacy of of Uhuru Kenyatta's presidency, where we see closer ties and closer cooperations with countries within the global South in terms of trading, in terms of doing business, in terms of selling their products in the countries in the global West and finding markets. So in essence, we see that President Kenyatta's foreign policy has largely been driven by that desire, again pegged on the economic diplomacy pillar, to increase markets and of course to increase markets and trade in countries in the global South.
The biggest trade partner for Kenya has been Uganda, next door. And now Tanzania is coming up very well. Very soon we are going to have DRG Congo trading, which has a vast potential, trading with Kenya. And so what we need to understand is that, look at area by area, just take Kenya as a whole. There are areas that produce potatoes. There are areas that produce banana. There are areas that produce coffee and tea, etc., etc. There are areas that provide fish. And so when we know that this area, this land, is potential is to produce tea, then we maximize from that area, from economic standpoint. And areas that produce other things, we maximize. So then we are now able to trade with each other, then trade with the rest. And so that's what Uhuru is focused on as far as Africa is concerned. Let us have open borders. Let us have open air with Ethiopia. Let us have exchange of knowledge and technology so that we can upgrade Africa. Kenya engineers can work in Nigeria, they can work in Ethiopia, they can work elsewhere. Ethiopia's engineers can work in Kenya and improve. And with that kind of exchange, Maina, you will not have what you call predatory behavior like what we're having with China right now.
However, critics mocked Kenyatta that in the process of advancing Kenya's agenda internationally, he made too many foreign trips, with some seen as unnecessary, and State House was accused of including joyriders in the delegations.
Well, in terms of soft power, diplomatic visits are very important. these foreign visits and meeting foreign dignitaries, meeting your contemporaries are important. But of course, we also understand the economics of it, which sometimes could be very costly, doing these foreign trips. If I can just jot your memory, if you look at the presidency of Magufuli, for example, he did very little foreign visits, and critics were also saying that the man was spending so much time in the country and not wooing investors and all that. So there are ways in which we can look at the cost-benefit analysis. For me, I think international or foreign trips are very, very important, and Kenyatta made several of them, which we can see he was able to woo potential investors into the country. The image of the country was also enhanced in terms of what we call public diplomacy, and of course increasing the soft power approach. But of course, there are those critics who say that much of this can be done by ambassadors who are residing in these countries. But I also believe that the president is the chief diplomat of the country. By him